A few years ago, I featured ThinkPad T60p on the channel that I picked up very cheap locally. I showed off all of its features and then upgraded it with some more memory and an SSD, and while no hardware has changed since then, what has changed is my testing software and methodology. In this quickie episode, let's see what a professional laptop from 2007 can do with a bigger, better game suite and some overclocking thrown into the mix. Before we throw this thing into the fray, I'll give you a quick refresher on the specs if you didn't watch the first video. The CPU is an Intel Core 2 Duo T7200 at 2 GHz, definitely not the fastest CPU for this laptop, but is still in third place right behind the T7400 and T7600. These are all part of the first generation of mobile Core 2 Duos, adding 64-bit support and a double-sized L2 cache to the previous 32-bit only Core Duo. All in all, it holds up well for Intel's second stab at mobile dual cores. Its modern usage is pretty much just limited to web browsing and video playback, but for the kind of games we're running, it'll be way more than enough. Our GPU is the decently capable ATI Mobility FireGL V5250. That name won't mean much to most of you, but it's pretty much just a mobile version of the Radeon X1600 Pro with lowered clocks. It's rocking the RV530 GPU, a 4-pipe part with a 3:1 ratio of shaders to pipes, meaning we have 12 pixel shaders, 5 vertex shaders, and 4 TMUs and ROPs. Clocks are not far from the X1600 Pro, being 432 MHz on the core and 320 MHz on the 256 MB of GDDR3. This is the component that we'll be tuning in today's video, which we'll get into in just a minute. Memory is nothing special with 4GB of DDR2 667 with a CAS latency of 5, although only 3GB are usable due to the chipset. It won't be a limiting factor in the games we're testing today though. And finally, everything's displayed on a dim but very crisp 1680 by 1050 panel. Much like the Inspiron 8600 we tested in a previous video, the resolution is so high that the GPU is not powerful enough to use it in most games. So this time we opted for lower 16 by 10 resolutions like 1280 by 800 instead, which look decent-ish considering the stretching. Now that we have the specs covered, we can jump right into tuning. I had to try a few overclocking utilities to find one that would work here. My go-to for these older ATI cards is ATI Tool, but the latest stable version wasn't able to apply any changes. And for some reason the 0.27 beta would just shut off our backlight. I really have no explanation for this. ATI trade tools work just fine though, and I chose to use low-level overclocking, which required disabling the ATI hotkey puller program. It means the card won't throttle its clocks down in 2D mode anymore. This wasn't really a huge deal. My biggest goal for the system was to match the desktop X1600 Pro in clock speeds, and surprisingly this mobile card was able to do it without even touching the voltage. This puts us at 500 MHz on the core and 390 MHz on the memory. Certainly not an earth-shattering overclock, but we'll need any help we can get. I also maxed out the fan with a ThinkPad fan control app to help keep this GPU cool, as it's easily the hottest part of the system. I couldn't find a way to tune the CPU on this platform, but it shouldn't be much of a bottleneck in any of the games we're testing. I also took the liberty of modding the cooler for the GPU. Thanks to Jam, I've installed a thin copper shim which should aid heat transfer over the crappy thermal pad it had before. And instead of 4 games, we're doubling the suite with 8, and release dates range from 2004 to 2009. It covers all kinds of DirectX 9 stuff. We've got some classics and some later, more shader-heavy games to really put this GPU to the test. Since we're limited to DX9 anyways, we might as well use Windows XP, so I loaded up the 32-bit professional version here. All captures were external since I don't own a VGA capture card at the moment, and for my results I used 3 runs and averaged out the numbers. With all of that said, let's now dig into some testing. Half-Life 2 is a little done to death, but it's a good benchmark nonetheless. Today we're using the original Collector's Edition with the high settings, 4xAF, and no AA. I also used my 75-second run of some Canals gameplay to get my numbers. Stock we're sitting at a nice and round 60 FPS average, while overclocked we saw 13% more frames at 68. Minor frame time swings filled both runs, but they were hardly perceptible, and there were only a couple of large spikes. Republic Commando is back in my testing, and I used the medium settings throughout with no AA and 30 seconds of combat for the bench. We scored 36 frames per second, and this stayed the same when overclocked, although there was a solid improvement in the 0.1% lows, which was repeatable between runs. Looking at the frame time graphs, we can see the overclock setup exhibits less stutters, although even at stock they happen so fast that it wasn't a deal breaker. Now we're ramping things up a bit with Fear, and I selected the minimum settings with medium effects and used the built-in benchmark for testing. Stock we got 51 FPS, and overclocked we're just crossing the 60 barrier. Frame times are poor, but this is to be expected with this game's benchmark, so it's not the laptop's fault. I'll add the image quality wasn't the greatest, but if you're looking for a 60 FPS average, then these settings are a worthwhile compromise in my opinion. 2006's Elder Scrolls Oblivion is up. This time we had to drop the resolution to 960 by 600, which looks a little stretched on this display, but it's still workable. I tested using the medium preset with bloom instead of HDR and used 60 seconds of running around for my test. The laptop put down 31 frames per second, and with the overclock this jumped up a great 23% to 38. The run had some stutter throughout with a few larger spikes sprinkled in here and there. Still a serviceable experience though. We're starting to see signs of this config struggling with this game. Next is Company of Heroes, and we're back up to 1280 by 800 with the low settings, and tests were completed using the built-in benchmark. We're scoring 74 frames per second, and overclocked this shot up 16% to 86. Unfortunately, we had a number of frame time related issues, from micro stutter to occasional hard stops, but I wouldn't see it being a complete deal breaker, I guess. This is my first time trying out Call of Duty 4 on the channel, and I chose the low settings throughout to go easy on this card. I benchmarked the opening scene as it's very consistent. The laptop scores 36 FPS on average, and while overclocked, we're 14% faster at 41. The percent low numbers are a bit misleading here, as you'd think the game was a micro stuttery mess, but it actually ran pretty smooth with minimal noticeable stutter. Second to last title is Devil May Cry 4, and we're dropping the resolution to 960 by 600 again, with low settings and no AA. In the first 60 seconds of the built-in benchmark, we got 57 frames per second, and while tuned, it's an impressive 19% faster at 68. I'm pleased to report that frame times were really good on both setups, with almost nothing in the way of noticeable stutter. And finally, at the request of HBlank, we have the original Red Faction Gorilla, and I'm using the Steam version here. Out of all the stuff we're testing, this is far and away the most demanding, so I dropped the resolution way down to 768 by 480 and chose the lowest preset possible. In 30 seconds of blowing some stuff up in the first level, we scored 30 frames per second, and overclocked was pretty much the same at 31. Frame times were not great either. Look, the pixels end up pretty huge at this res, and I'd only call it borderline playable, but that's still playable, I guess. It's probably one of the most demanding games you could reasonably run on this system. Well, that's my re-review of the ThinkPad T60p, and I've got a few key takeaways here. First off, it's definitely worth overclocking the Fire GLP 5250 if you want to squeeze the best out of this config. Most of the dual cores it comes with are fast enough to where the GPU is the bottleneck, so this really helps to even things out. If you want to know the precise figures, overclocking made us 15% faster on average in all of the games we tested, so you can claim lots of free performance if you're willing to tune it a bit. As for the performance itself, the laptop was perfectly adequate for a lot of early to mid-2000s DirectX 9 games, although I would be wary of later, more shader-heavy games. As shown here, they're generally going to require lower resolutions and settings, but it's nice to know they're at least somewhat playable on this laptop. Finally, once again, the display is kind of raining on our parade a bit. It's just way too high a resolution for this GPU to take advantage of it. I'd rather have a lower resolution 4x3 panel instead, but if there's a silver lining, it makes desktop usage really good with all that real estate. All told, the ThinkPad T60p is a professional laptop first, but if you're willing to tinker, it makes a very solid DX9 mobile gaming rig. Its durability and reasonable footprint make this a strong contender for any trips as well. I'll be bringing it with me the next time I'm out of town for a while. With that, I think now I've explored this thing thoroughly enough. Thank you all for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one.